said it that way. It's been a day.
I hear you on that.
Can I sit with you, Miranda? You can certainly sit with me. I'm going back to the sat if you didn't.
Let's actually go back.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Carrie Coogan. I'm Deputy Director of Public Affairs and Community Engagement, and we're so thrilled to have you here tonight. I'd also like to welcome all of our viewers on the library's YouTube channel. Thank you for being here. I wanted to let you know that we will be taking questions after the event tonight. And if you're watching online, feel free to just drop a question in the chat, and we'll make sure to answer your question online as well. I also want to extend my thanks to Bliss Books for being here to make sure that the book tonight, Witness, is available for purchase and for signing after the event, so you can step right outside and purchase, and Jamel will sign. I also wanted to let everybody know about a really incredible event that's going to be happening here on Wednesday night next week right here at the Plaza. We are going to be hosting a premiere screening of the national PBS documentary Free for All, The Public Library. So this film is about how public libraries shape the country and continue to be a vital sanctuary for Americans everywhere. Best of all, our library, the Kansas City Public Library, is one of the featured libraries in this film. Yeah, isn't that exciting? So we will be hosting the two producers of the film, Lucy Faulkner and Dawn Logston, and they will be in conversation with KCUR's Steve Kraske. So we hope that you will join us on Wednesday night right here at the Plaza. So we're so thrilled to welcome Jamel Brinkley, the winner of tonight's 2024 Maya Angelou Book Award, for his incredible short story collection, Witness. The Angelou Award was created to honor work that speaks to social justice and expands the reach of American literature, and Witness does exactly that. This event is part of an incredible partnership with UMKC's Cock-A-Fair Chair in Continuing Education, which named Jamel this year's Visiting Writer in Residence and helped make tonight's lecture possible. Thank you so much to the Cock-A-Chair group and all of the work that you do at UMKC. Hi, Michael. Jamel is also the author of A Lucky Man, a finalist for the National Book Award. His stories appear in The New Yorker, the Paris Review, and many other places, and he's known for writing with real heart, insight, and clarity about people and relationships. And tonight, he'll be in conversation with the library's own Anne Kniggendorf. Anne is our senior writer and editor, and she also holds an MFA in fiction from UMKC, and for more than a decade has loved interviewing authors and poets and writing about their work for local, national, and international publications. She's also the author of Secret Kansas City and Kansas City Scavenger. Please join me tonight in welcoming both Jamel Brinkley and Anne Kniggendorf.
Thank you for being here. We're excited to have such a good crowd, and I think there are a lot of, if you're an MFA student, raise your hand. Do we have many? Oh, good. Yay, we have so many. Okay. Well, this first question is sort of for all of you while we're getting to know each other and warming up here a little bit. But so you teach at the Iowa Writers Workshop, and you've been there for 5 years, but that's also where you earned your MFA, right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah, so I just thinking about the MFA students here and the choices they have ahead of them, you know, I'm kind of wondering about your trajectory as someone who was a student 10 years ago, right? And then,
right.
And now you're at the Iowa Writers Workshop. And how did you get from being a student to deciding what you wanted to do with that degree?
Oh, yeah, thank you for that question. I'm not sure how much I got to decide, to be honest with you.
Really? You were just swept up?
A little bit. I mean, I think, so I should back up a little bit and kind of explain my thinking going into the MFA. When I started my graduate creative writing program, I thought it was just going to be kind of a break from my regular life. I was teaching high school English when I got into graduate school, and I thought that would be my career, that I would just be teaching high school English for the rest of my life. And I thought, I'm just going to give myself the gift of these 2 years to learn about writing, because I've cared about writing since I was a child. And in my mind, I thought, I'm going to show up in the fall of 2013, and I'm going to go back to New York City in the spring of 2015 once I get my degree, and I'm somehow going to resume my high school teacher life. But of course, when I got to the program, it transformed everything for me. It just made me think that what I've been doing isn't exactly what I want to be doing. It was kind of adjacent to what I wanted to be doing, engaging with works of literature, talking about writing. But I really wanted to be doing writing in a more central way. So I think as I approached the second year of my graduate program, I all of a sudden scrambled and started to try to figure out ways to continue doing what I was doing. And so I ended up staying for a postgraduate year in which I taught an undergraduate class. And then I was fortunate enough, and this is what I mean by, I don't know if I chose, but I was fortunate enough to get a one-year fellowship at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that allowed me to kind of revise what became A Lucky Man. And then from there, I kind of buzzed around in California for a year. And then I got another fellowship at Stanford University.
Wow.
And so from there, it just so happened that some of the faculty members who were my teachers at Iowa were starting to retire. And so there were positions open at Iowa, and I applied and was able to get the job, And so it was sort of a combination of me realizing what my priorities were and there being opportunity.
Okay, and you mentioned your first collection, A Lucky Man, and that one was a finalist for the National Book Award, among some other really big ones. So in the 5 years that the Maya Angelou Award has existed, your second book, Witness, is the first collection of short stories to win. And it's kind of, I think this is right, that it's a little historically unusual for short story collections to get that much attention with the big awards.
Absolutely,
Why
yes.
is that?
Well, the one practical reason, or one sort of profit-motivated reason, is that they don't sell very well. They don't get a lot of attention. Publishers want novels. Readers seem to want novels, or at least that's what publishers think readers want. And so, any kind of recognition for these two books has been completely surprising to me, because it sort of feels like if you're writing a short story collection that you're a writer's writer automatically. That's your audience, other writers, But I do think that what my collections have done and other collections have done has proven that not to be true, which is very heartening. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I guess another thing, what I was thinking of was that people want that full story arc also, or at least there's the perception that people do, because it almost makes it hard then when you're writing about it, about a collection or interviewing a short story writer, like, well, so what do we talk about? And so, but with yours, like you don't have a plot through line or a character through line to talk about, but you do have this sort of thematic or like idea word through line in this particular collection, which is the word witness. So did you think of that beforehand, or did you write some stories and say, wait a second, these are thematically linked? How did that happen?
Yeah, so Witness came together a little differently than A Lucky Man did. I didn't realize that there were thematic connections in the stories in my first collection until I had written all of them, like a bunch of stories, including ones that did not make it into the collection. With Witness, I realized maybe 3 stories in that I was sort of writing in a particular direction. And that was both comforting and worrying to me, because I didn't want to feel like I was going to be writing the same story over and over again, But it was actually heartening in some ways, because my conception of a really good short story collection, my model for a good short story collection is an album, like a really well put together musical album.
Oh, so you have to real carefully curate the order?
Exactly,
Okay.
the order, and you feel like from beginning to end, if you listen to a great album, think of your favorite album. You're going on a journey from the beginning of the album until the last song on the album. And that's sort of my model for what a great short story collection should be. So I got over my worry really quickly and just started to believe that I could write into this theme that I eventually felt was actually rather capacious.
Yeah, and the stories are all really different. Yeah, and so I kept thinking, if you had named it something else, like how closely would I have needed to pay attention to pick up on the witness part? Like, did you think about that too?
Oh, that's so interesting.
Because if you'd called it like Life in the Bronx or something
Right,
like
right,
that, not that you
right.
would, that's terrible, but
Yeah, that's not
yeah.
a great title, but I know
No,
what you mean. Yeah. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know,
That's not really a question.
no. It's a good question because I think that maybe sometimes for an artist, and you know this, like sometimes you worry about being too on the nose.
Yeah.
Right? That it's going to drive a reader's attention in too strongly a way. But for me, I just kept feeling like, you know what? The way that I think about this idea of witness is large. They can contain so many different kinds of characters, so many different kinds of stories, that it's not on the nose. Because it's sort of like we're looking at this idea from a lot of different directions, right? And every direction or every perspective you look at it from makes it slightly different, and that ended up being exciting for me.
Yeah, so this would normally seem like too minute a question to ask, but what do you think of as the common uses of the word witness? And then what other uses did you discover over these 10 stories?
Yeah, so I think the most common usage is just someone who perceives something. Like you are a witness to something, right? Your sense perceptions, you see something, you are alert to something, right? But then the idea sort of expands, right? So for instance, what's the difference between a bystander and a witness? I think there is a difference, right? Or what's the difference between a witness who's just seeing and a witness, say, in court who is offering a testimony, right? Someone who not only sees something that's happening, but also is speaking to what's happening. And in the best version of that, you're speaking to something in the interest of a certain kind of justice, right? To right or wrong, right? Or to correct a misperception, right? So I started to figure out that there were all these different ways of thinking about witness, more than just an act of someone seeing something, right? To expand that definition and to explore it in its full capacity.
Was there any particular reason that word?
Well, you know, so one of my big influence as a writer is actually one of Maya Angelou's good friends, James Baldwin. And there are beautiful, you can find beautiful videos of them talking to each other on YouTube. It's fantastic the way that they speak to each other, and I highly recommend you look up these Baldwin-Angelou conversations. But if you look at Baldwin's writings, especially his nonfiction writings, he's always talking about the idea of witness. It's one of his key words. You know, menace is another one of his key words, you know. And once you sort of pick up on a writer's key language, the lenses through which they're looking at things, you really see how a word can become so resonant and powerful and multivalent. And so I kept thinking about this word witness from James Baldwin and the responsibility of being a witness and the difference between being a witness and being an actor, right? Every time it came up, it kind of meant slightly something different. And so in a way, you know, Baldwin supplies one of the epigraph, you know, supplies an epigraph to the book. In a way, this book is sort of a way of honoring Baldwin, who's one of my favorite writers.
Okay, yeah, that epigraph is, I was to discover that the line which separates a witness from an actor is a very thin line indeed. Nevertheless, the line is real. So what was that? How did you think of the line between witness and actor then? And like what story for you shows that really clearly?
Oh, wow.
Or even an example, like I kept trying to think about it in terms of current events, which I know gets kind of dicey.
Yeah.
But thinking about, Well, I will let you supply if you're interested in that line of inquiry there, but
Yeah.
yeah, but one of your stories is fine too.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't know if this is a story you had in mind, but I'm thinking of the title story, for instance. So the title story of the collection is narrated by the brother of a woman who she's sick, and she's experiencing medical racism. And part of the exploration of that story is, what does it mean for this brother, this sibling, a family member, an intimate, to be so close to a sister who is suffering? Is he seeing her suffering? What's the difference between seeing it and actually fully recognizing it and absorbing it? What's the difference between that and acting on what you're seeing, being a responsible person? And if you do or don't act, what does that mean in terms of your sense of guilt or responsibility, right? And so that's a story where I think the brother ends up feeling like he failed as a witness.
Yeah, and her boyfriend, or no, the husband
Yes.
failed, and then the
Yes.
doctors, of course, failed.
Yes, everyone fails this woman.
And so there is no actor.
Exactly.
Really, even the woman herself.
Yeah.
Like she's witnessing these changes in her body, and she doesn't know what to do either.
Doesn't know what to do because she doesn't know, where does she have recourse? She tries to sort of explain to her doctors, but once you get a sense that maybe the people who are supposed to be caring for you aren't listening, whether they're your family members or friends or medical professionals, then what are you supposed to do, right? And so maybe then she sort of sits back and doesn't do as much for herself as she could because she feels like no one is listening to her. And that's a horrible position to be in. But you're right. I think that in a story like that, where you see no one is acting in the way that Baldwin is maybe talking about acting, I hope to actually highlight the importance of acting, right? The importance of not being a bystander, the importance of not merely seeing, but then acting on what you see in a responsible and a generous way.
Yeah, and it's interesting because she gets shut down and ignored so much, she does the same then internally. She shuts down and ignores those signals that she has been witnessing in herself.
Which I think is a very human thing to do. Like, how much can you take? If you feel utterly alone in your suffering and your attempts have just sort of gone ignored, what are you supposed to do? I think it's a very human response on her part, to just sort of say, all I have is me. No one is really listening to me.
Yeah, so what does it matter?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, after I finished this, I kept going back to the idea of a ghost as a witness,
Yes.
since that does come up also, and that's in a story called Arrows.
Yeah.
And I kept wondering if it matters if the ghost is actually really a ghost, like if this is sort of a fantastical realism situation where there's really a ghost in this room,
There's really a ghost.
Does it matter if it's that, or does it witness-wise and story-wise, or is it all the same if it's the son imagining what his mother would say if she were there instead of this, we don't know, a physical manifestation of some kind, I don't know.
Yeah.
Does it make a difference?
I think, what I hope, or what I think that particular story, Arrows, is doing, I sort of think that either way, whether she's actually a ghost or whether it's sort of an imagination of what she would say, I think in both instances, it works. It works both ways. Because
So she's a witness either way, it doesn't matter.
Either way. Either it's sort of he's hearing her or imagining her, and it's in a way his conscience speaking to him, or she's actually a ghost and is haunting him. And I think of a haunting as sort of this seething presence of the past, right? I'm sure everyone in this room has had the experience of something from your past feeling hauntingly present, right? What's in the past is not necessarily gone, right? And so that's the reason why, for me, I personally, I leave it up to readers to decide, but I'll say as a reader of my own story, I do think she's a ghost. She's an actual ghost. And for me, that ghost stands for someone who can speak to a past that the narrator is not fully reckoning with. And that's what's important.
And that will still change his decisions, right?
Yes, exactly. Like if he were willing to fully face what the mother is saying in that story, maybe he would make a different decision. But he kind of refuses to, and he holds on to his version of things, his narrow version of things, right? And I'm sure this is an experience we all have as well. Like you have your sense of what happened, right? And it's interesting to figure out how willing you are to engage other people's versions of the past. And if you are willing to engage it, maybe that changes things quite a lot for you, and it changes your sense of what it is that you have to do and what your responsibilities to the people in your life are.
So that's a really interesting kind of way to twist around the idea of witnessing and acting, because it's something that's spurring you on to act, just the idea of what an objective look at your actions might seem like.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, well, being a witness to yourself.
Uh-huh.
How about that? You
Yeah.
know,
Uh-huh.
like taking a hard look at yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the importance of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you talk about this ghost being a kind of witness and you can't ignore the past. And it made me think about Blessed Deliverance,
Yes.
the opening story of your collection. So that has to do with not wanting to ignore the past of a changing neighborhood.
Right.
Yeah, and so this group of kids in the story, they've witnessed changes to their neighborhood, and it seems like changes to place may create a type of ghost too, but you wrote in, for me, what felt like an unexpected twist there also, which was that the story deals with the loss of active memories because of our reliance on technology,
Yeah.
so like Googling things.
Yes.
So these kids have borne witness to all these changes, but the past itself becomes vague and ghostly in their minds.
Right.
Yeah, so I wondered if you would read a little bit of that and kind of
sure.
set up that story, because that was another, like all of these stories have some kind of just really, really great idea twist
Yeah.
to them, you know, that.
Yeah.
So that's where I wanted you to read. But if you could set that up, please, first.
Oh, sure. Let's see where we are. Oh, okay. So just to set up for this. So this is a group of teenage friends. They're all in high school in Brooklyn, New York. And as you said, one of the things that they're sort of observing is the way that their neighborhood is changing, right? The way that places maybe they grew up with have all of a sudden become a different place, right? Some of this is just natural change. Some of this is things based on or caused by gentrification, right? And so what's happening in this part of the story is that there's all of a sudden a very strange sort of new place in the middle of their neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. And this place is like a rabbit shelter, which seems like a strange thing to have.
Rabbit rescue?
A rabbit rescue
In the city?
In the middle of New York City. And I should say also, before I read, that that part of the story is actually based on my living in a different city, Oakland, California. And where I lived, shortly after I moved into my apartment in Oakland, California, a rabbit rescue opened up on the corner. And it was so strange. No one was ever in there. No one went into this place because it just stuck out like a sore thumb, and no one had much interest in it, right? And so this place in the story, as was the place in Oakland in real life for me, which is very peculiar. So that's where we are in the story. You can't really expect there to be a lot of rabbit adoptions in the hood, Ronnie said, with a razor in her voice. Why not? He replied. History tells us that rabbits appeal to people from all walks of life. Certain rodents, too, studies have shown. Besides, this isn't really the hood anymore, is it? Cyan was right about that last part, though he spoke as if he had absolutely nothing to do with it. His comment made us stare first at him and then around at the drivers parading by in their eco-friendly cars, and the cyclists who actually wore helmets and biking shorts, pumping their nickel-bright knees, assaulting us with their show of law-abiding goodness and safety. But all of that was oppressively dull. We knew it too well, so we didn't comment on it. What was interesting to us were the people and the places that were gone. When Cyan went back inside, and as head-ass continued his marching and moaning, we found ourselves scrutinizing the rescue itself. What exactly had been there before? Any one of us could have gone in and asked Cyan or the rescue ladies about it, but none of us wanted to. There was nothing appealing about the possibility of acquiring the information from them, from some records they had dug up as part of a business plan. It would have been that merely information, data. Looking it up with a phone would have felt similarly cheap. The thing was to remember, to use our minds and their keen, branching tails, to recollect via the spark of the scintillating connections we could make on our own. But once the topic was broached and we discussed it among ourselves, no one could conjure up the answer. For a long time before the opening of the rescue, the space had been empty, with a sign in the clouded window that read "Commercial Space for Rent."
Thank you. Yeah. So you mentioned that rabbit shelter was in Oakland. So could these stories and this examination of witness have really taken place in anywhere other than the Bronx and Brooklyn where you grew up? I mean, could the stories have just as easily been around Oakland or Iowa City? Or was there something, you talked, when we talked before, you told me about the unique personalities and that they're almost like connotations or something like to the neighborhood's names.
Yeah.
So was that a big part of this for you?
Yeah, I think with something like this rabbit rescue, I do think there's something about the opening of a place like that that could take place in lots of different places around the country, right? It could happen in a lot of different places, a lot of different cities, right? Because of forces that are, national, right? That are happening countrywide. But at the same time, I do think the specific location of Brooklyn was important, right? That this instance of a space like that opening, of gentrification, of things changing so rapidly that you lose your memory of them in a certain kind of way, is particular to Brooklyn in a way that, one, just reflects my own experience, having lived in Brooklyn for a long time in my life, right? And sort of having a real familiarity with what Brooklyn was like at a certain point in time and what it's like, say, now. And then the particulars of the kinds of people in Brooklyn specifically and how they may react to that kind of change. So I was trying to point to something general in one instance, but at the same time I wanted it to be intentionally and forcefully specific about Brooklyn.
Okay, I keep trying to think what the equivalent to that would be around here and wondering how that would change a story. But that's what's happening in my own head.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be part of this conversation.
Yeah.
So another kind of witnessing that really got my attention in this was the idea of being a second-hand witness.
Yes.
Like, I don't think I'd ever really thought about that at all. Like, when you
Yes.
tell somebody a story, hey, this crazy thing happened to me, you're sort of forcing witnessing onto somebody
That's
else
right.
in a way,
That's right.
which was really different for me to think about. So that happens in Bartow Station. Bartow Station.
Yeah.
Will you describe what happens in that story?
Yeah, so this story, just to summarize it quickly, the story is narrated by a pretty, for the bulk of the story, a young man who expresses himself in sort of terse ways. He's very sort of tightly held, right? He speaks in very short utterances, or he doesn't speak at all. He's reluctant to speak. He's a little bit of a loner, and he starts a job working for UPS. He starts making deliveries around New York City, and his job brings him into contact with a young woman who works at a flower shop. And he becomes interested in her. And he finds himself kind of almost against his own desires in some ways, kind of falling into a sort of a relationship with her, a situationship, as some people might say. And so at first things seem to be going well between them, but again, he's someone, just imagine trying to connect with someone who sort of refuses to share themselves with you. That can be so frustrating, right? And as the story moves along, she becomes frustrated with this kind of inability to share himself, to sort of articulate himself, to sort of reveal himself to her. And she thinks it's maybe has something to do with her, right? And so there comes a climactic point in the story when he tries to explain what's wrong with him, right? And he's unable to explain what's wrong with him in terms of the very present moment with her, because what's wrong with him actually goes way back in time, right? What's wrong with him is that he lost a family member who was very close to him, and he's never been the same since. So he witnessed the death of someone in his family, right? And in some ways he feels responsible for the death of that person in his family. And the fact that he feels responsible for the death of this person has sort of caused this sort of clenched up personality that he has, right? And so what he does with this woman that he's been seeing is that rather than say, oh, I'm just having a bad day, or, let's work this thing out with our relationship, he just sort of finally tells this entire story about what happened to his family member when he was young. And it's a whole elaborate story. It's a full, big story. In some ways, I can imagine from her perspective, she's like, why are you telling me this? Like, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with our relationship, but it does. It has to do with his ability to connect with anyone in any relationship, right? And so he tells her this story, and at the end of the story, she acknowledges that it's an awful story, a tragic story, a sad story. But as a listener to his story, as a witness to his story, she kind of refuses it. She's like, I don't know what this has to do with me and why you're treating me this way, why you can't share with me, right? And so he finally unburdens himself and tells this whole story, this intimate story, this story that he wouldn't share with anyone. But in this moment of telling, she listens, sort of acknowledges, but it's sort of like, I can't deal with this. Right, and that's basically sort of the main currents of that story.
Yeah, after bugging him and asking him,
yes.
Open up, open up, open up.
Right.
Yeah, and so you've said that this was caused reader controversy, right? Like you hear from people who are mad.
Yeah, they're mad at her. They're mad at this character. They're mad at her because they want her to be more empathetic. They want her to sort of offer more comfort for this character. And she refuses. It's too much for her. And so I've heard from multiple readers, including friends of mine who are also writers, they're like, it is so sad and devastating and wrong of her to respond to this terrible story, this terrible experience he went through by essentially rejecting him. I have heard that, yes.
But then that reminds me of the way we see things on TV, right? And in the news, and we say, I'm going to go back to this novel I'm reading.
That's right.
And I don't want to see anything else. Is it the same kind of thing?
I think so. I think it's very similar, if it's not the same.
Huh?
It's too much sometimes, right? You have that feeling, right? When things are terrible out there, when you turn on the news or read the paper and it's just this onslaught, there's a way for your self-preservation, right? Where you can just be like, this is too much. I can't face this. I can't deal with this. I can't reckon with this. I'm just going to go and do what I have to do to take care of myself, right? And you can think of that as a selfish decision. You can think of that as an irresponsible decision. You can think of that as a decision that makes perfect human sense, right? But I hope, if the story is pointing us in a direction that you're suggesting it does, I hope it makes us think about that decision, right? When we're turning away, when we're choosing self-preservation over some other choice, where we might become more active, where we might become more responsible. That decision is actually quite vital and quite important, And so you can be upset about the decision, but think about it, right? And are the people who are upset about it, do they always do the right thing? Right?
Who's acting?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, the way you put that makes me think of, Henry James had the brother William James, who was a psychologist.
Yes.
And there's something that William James wrote in one of his seminal works on psychology about this. He has this example of this person who leaves, everybody has their carriage or whatever, and all these people have gone to the theater. And the carriage driver is sitting out in the snow because he's not allowed to go in. And there's some great tragedy that these people have gone to see at the theater. And then, the whole time their carriage driver's out there freezing. And I can't quite remember what it is, but William James has, the people come out of the theater and he's like, what was that art for if you have no compassion for this person right in front of you?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's always amazing to me to sort of see people's capacity not to know.
And not to act.
And not to act, right? And the excuse not to act is often, well, I don't know. Like, I'm going to refuse to know in the first place. I'm going to refuse to acknowledge. I'm going to refuse to hear, right? And so if you take 2 steps back, then, I really don't have to do anything, right? And so in some ways, the woman in this story, her reaction is also the result of a refusal to truly hear, in the sense that hearing in a true way, in a substantive way, would have to result in a different kind of action, right? But she kind of has to back off from it, in a couple of senses. It's not like I truly hear you and I won't act. I think it's I hear you, but I don't hear you. And that not hearing you allows me to make the decision that I did.
So I really appreciated that the collection was so idea-driven. And one of the other ideas I keep going back to, which is in that same story, was your phrase, kindness without consequence.
Yeah.
So it's like, I kept wondering, does that mean that you're being present with someone and being present enough to be kind? So that's like witnessing this moment together or something like that? Maybe I don't have to force witnessing onto everything, do I? Can we back off of witnessing for that, or is that part of it? And just what does that mean, kindness without consequence, especially in the context of Bartow's Station?
Yeah, so just to continue, so you're referring to sort of the very end of the story.
Right, the guy goes about his business. He goes back to his UPS truck. This
Yes.
situationship seems to be over because
So it's over.
yeah, he's
It's
been
totally
rejected.
over.
But
Yeah.
then there's this, it turns around in this sort of positive way, and he's thinking there can be kindness without consequence.
Yeah.
And like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I think in the case of this particular character, he unburdens himself to this woman that he's been seeing, and she doesn't respond well. And so he goes back to being a loner who's a UPS driver. And the kindness without consequence quote that you're referring to sort of refers to his interactions with people on a daily basis as he's delivering packages, right? And he's talking about, you deliver a package and people are just courteous. They say thank you, you can sort of exchange pleasantries. And to me, the more I think about it, I feel like it has a double edge. It has, in the sense of kindness without consequence, meaning very surface level kindness.
Like
right?
habitual kindness.
Habitual kindness, where you're not truly affecting each other's lives.
But
right?
you're saying, how are you, and being
You're saying,
pleasant.
how are you? And so the other side of it is that's kind of a nice thing. He begins to appreciate the fact that, I can do this job and meet all these strangers essentially around the city, or maybe some people who I see multiple times, so they're something quite different a little different than strangers. And we can exchange kindness. And for someone who, I think, in the case of that character, someone who has kind of suffered a horrible traumatic experience. And in this particular story, someone who has suffered a failure of connection. I think for him, that kindness without consequence is something that he holds on to as important, the thing that kind of gets him through the days, right? And so I kind of, at the end of that story, I like my endings to feel ambiguous. So in the one sense, he's found a kind of pleasure or joy in his everyday job, making these connections, kindness without consequence. In another case, that kindness without consequence stands in for another kind of kindness that would be more substantive, more deep, the kind of kindness that he was seeking when he finally unburdened himself to this woman that he was seeing, but that she rejected. So on the one hand, it's like, great, I do have this thing. I appreciate everyday kindnesses, but that's all I have, because I don't have kindness with any depth.
Ouch. It's like, what do you say to that?
Yeah, but I want both. I want both things to be there. I want you to feel two ways at once. I feel like the best art makes you feel multiple ways at once, where you feel a little sad, but you feel a little happy at the same time.
Yeah, that definitely did.
Yeah.
The description of the person with the flowers and the.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, just one more thing before we go to audience Q&A.
Sure.
We've got the microphones out already, but. Will you tell me, please, what winning this award means to you, the Maya Angelou Book Award?
Oh my gosh, it means so much. I was telling you before we started this conversation that it was just a total surprise to me. Maya Angelou herself, Missouri native, obviously, but someone who, as someone who was for me, and I'm sure for many of us in this room, when you become a reader at a young age, and you sort of move from reading children's books to young readers' books to reading more serious literature, it's kind of difficult not to encounter Maya Angelou. Just sort of read her work early on. I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And then to sort of encounter her not only as the author of that book, but as a real intellectual who thinks a lot about what it means to tell stories. I think I mentioned to you before her phrase, deep talk, right, as a way of thinking about what a story means. Like a story is not a real story unless it's deep talk, unless it has a certain kind of substance, a certain kind of depth. Thinking about, all the images I've seen of her, all the the clips I mentioned earlier with her and, some of my other favorite writers like James Baldwin, having deep artistic conversations, it means quite a lot, right? But one thing I'll say is that one of my favorite exchanges between those two writers in particular, Baldwin and Maya Angelou, they're talking about what it means for a writer to have quote-unquote success. Right, this is a clip you can also find on YouTube. You can find it online. And they're sort of having this exchange, and Baldwin says, essentially he says something like, the worst thing you can do as a writer is to think of yourself as a success. And Maya Angelou, in this really beautiful, kind of churchy way, says, can you say that again? That's how she says it. Can you say that again? She wants to hear it again, because it's important. Right? And he says the worst thing you can do as an artist is to think of yourself as a success. Why? Because for many reasons. One, you might rest on your laurels. You might stop experimenting. You might stop being ambitious, trying new things. You just think, oh, this made me a success. I'm just going to keep doing that. Right? You might become egotistical. There are lots of reasons why thinking of yourself explicitly as a success is actually the wrong way to go. And so the two of them are kind of riffing off of each other in terms of this idea, and that's such a great reminder for me winning this award, right, named after her, because at the same time, that is such an honor, and I feel really grateful, and someone might look at it as a marker of success, right? I keep that conversation that they had in mind. you know.
So you won't do this again? This is the
No,
same thing?
something different.
Something different.
Right, keep pushing. Don't become arrogant or egotistical. Keep experimenting. Keep willing to fail, right? Don't rest on your laurels. Don't treat people differently because you win some honor, right? So all those things are a great reminder that, at the same time as I'm so thrilled to win an award in her name, I also have to remember those orders, right? Don't think of yourself as a success.
Good orders.
Yes,
Okay,
very
and
good
we can
orders.
take an order from Maya.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so what we'll do now is take some audience questions. If you do have a question, please come up to one of these two microphones so that people watching on YouTube will be able to hear you. And if anybody on YouTube has a question, you can type it in the chat, and I will be able to see that, and I will ask the question for you.
Wow.
Technology.
Yeah.
Okay, so if anybody has something, please come on up. And I'll see if anybody at home is asking something.
Evening. Thank you, Jamel, for being here.
Thank you.
For having a great conversation. So many thoughts are going through my head, too, about the words that connect. So kindness and witness, the sense of being, especially being in a difficult time where we are right now, and the laden quality that words can take, and that ambiguity is so lovely. And so here you have a background from away back east in a big city, and now you're in Iowa. So at the risk of resting on any laurels from success, but thinking about the word that came to my mind was curiosity. Do you have enough curiosity in Iowa, or are you lured back maybe home? Where is home? How does the curiosity unfold for Jamel now?
Oh, wow. That's a really terrific question. Curiosity is a fantastic word, and I'm glad you invoked it. I think I would answer the question in two ways. I do find that my imagination as a writer still kind of points back east. The stories that occur to me, the stories that sort of pop up in my mind, the possibilities for stories are still stories that point back east to the place where I, spent the first decades of my life. So I think in the deepest way, New York is still home for me. I don't know if that will change. I'm not insisting upon that. I don't feel like I have to write about New York, or I would not refuse an Iowa story, for example. But in terms of curiosity, I live and teach for most of every year in Iowa City. And my curiosity is so engaged about in terms of it's just a different life. Like living in Iowa City is so different than living in New York City. And my curiosity is always activated in terms of those different rhythms, right? What it means to walk down the street. I walk down the street differently in Iowa City than I do in New York City. It's a different pace. When I get to New York, I'm fast, walking. In Iowa City, there's another kind of pace that I have that I enjoy. It's a slower pace, I feel like I'm more alert to a different kind of cadence. And that's very interesting to me. The other thing that's interesting to me that I'll mention in Iowa City is that I'm constantly being exposed to all these wonderful stories that my students are writing, and they're coming from all over the place. And I'm insanely curious about what they're interested in. I'm insanely curious about, writers who are younger than me, what they're writing about, what they're interested in. And that really sustains me because I'm getting this constant stimulus, of different kinds of stories, different kinds of interests. Writers from all over the country, writers from all over the world, right? And so I kind of feel like while my writing imagination is sort of pointing east, my curiosity in that sense is pointing east. a different kind of curiosity, as a reader, perhaps as a teacher, as someone who, lives in two places, but mostly in this place, which is not out east. I feel like there's a different kind of living curiosity that happens there, which I like. I like having, my mind kind of branching in both of those different directions. Yeah.
So we do have a couple of questions from YouTube.
Oh, cool.
So the first is, what's your favorite James Baldwin story? I love Sonny's Blues.
Yes, my favorite Baldwin short story is absolutely Sonny's Blues. I actually mentioned it to the graduate creative writers here earlier today. I mentioned that story.
Why is that your favorite? I've read it, but it was like 5 years ago, and I can't completely remember the details.
So this story is it's a first-person story that's narrated by an older brother who's a teacher.
Okay. That came back.
Yes.
Okay, but keep going.
Yes, and there's a younger brother in the story who's kind of in trouble. That's kind of how the story begins. My younger brother's in trouble. He's someone who is interested in music. He's a musician. He's a jazz musician. But he's also sort of in trouble because he's has been involved in the world of drugs, has sort of been involved, has kind of been had police interactions, things like that. It's my favorite short story of Baldwin's. I have a favorite novel of Baldwin's too, but it's my favorite short story of Baldwin's because it feels like his most sustained and deeply imagined effort at imagining what it's like for two brothers who are estranged to sort of face the possibility of renewed connection and responsibility. And the ending of that story is classic. They come together in a space where the younger brother is playing music and the older brother witnesses it, right? And it's a space where you can see the younger brother come into he's at home in this space. And you feel like it's the only time, maybe the first time, in their lives that the older brother is seeing the younger brother in a way that recognizes his beauty, right? His strength, his power, right? His talent. And I love that the story kind of engages in this reversal, right? You sort of see someone who at the beginning of the story seems to be just a mess, who's living a mess of a life. But at the end of the story, you see him in this really triumphant moment, And so the emotions of that are so rich and beautiful and complicated. I really love that.
I have another one from home, but you can go ahead, Brandon.
So after Blessed Deliverance, The Happiest House on Union Street, I think is the most memorable to me in this collection. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the genesis of that story, and then also in the graduate talk earlier, you mentioned about starting in media res, and the first sentence of this is, the next unusual thing was how quickly the pumpkins out on the stoop began to rot. How long did it take to land on that opening? And yeah, just tell us about the genesis of that story.
Yeah, so I guess I should give you a little context about the story. The Happiest House on Union Street. So this is a third-person story. The main character in the story is a little girl. And the little girl lives with her uncle and her father, who are twins. And essentially what happens in the story, this is another kind of gentrification story. The genesis for the story, though, is actually, I had read in the newspaper about a phenomenon going on in New York and other places called deed theft. You know deed theft? And so people were going, these sort of criminals, essentially, were going to people and tricking them into signing over the ownership of their houses. This has been a phenomenon. I read about it a few years ago, several years back now, I guess. And disproportionately, this was happening to African Americans. So I was really interested in this as a phenomenon, but what really interested me or kind of captured my attention and made me think I could write a story about it, were the faces of the people who had been tricked, who had been conned out of their homes, and the things that they were, the pain, the ache, the feeling of sort of helplessness and the desire for justice that these people were expressing. So I really tried to think about what it would be like to be tricked in this way. But one of the ways I write stories is to sort of try to approach a story from unexpected angles. So rather than write from the perspective of an adult who had been tricked into signing over the home, I thought, what if I write from the perspective of a child who lives in the home and isn't fully able to comprehend exactly what's going on, right? And one of my challenges for the story is how to convey what's going on through the consciousness of a little girl who doesn't have language for what's going on. She's just sort of observing the adults in the house reacting to this horrible thing that has happened. So that's the context for the story, and that's how I got the idea for the story. How I landed on that first line was that I wanted to convey, rather than start a story in the mud and try to convey the deed theft itself from the beginning, or the girl starting to realize that something is off, I wanted to start in a space where things have already been strange. She has known at the beginning of the story that something is wrong. So when I say the next thing, right, what I want readers to understand is that there have been other things, and that you're joining the story, you're joining an experience that has been ongoing, and you just have to kind of, swim in that river, swim in the flow of that river. And I wanted the energy of the story to just sort of pull you in an almost confused way, in the same way that the little girl is confused. So you're kind of with her, you're aligned with her in some sense.
Okay, we've got one more from somebody watching at home, and then we will go to signing. So there's still copies of Jamel's book out in the lobby. People can buy, and then he'll be signing just right out there where the reception was. So somebody watching on YouTube says, do you see yourself in any way as a descendant of the other great short story authors, Carver, Chekhov, Borges?
Ooh, wow. I wouldn't want to claim that.
You're not just like Chekhov?
No, I would never claim that. But what I will say is, I don't know if I'm a descendant, but I do think that one of the interesting things about being a writer or any kind of artist is that you can kind of choose your ancestors in a certain sort of way, which doesn't mean that you see yourself as, being in the same stratosphere as those people, but that these are the people who move you. These are the people who you aspire to meet in terms of quality of art, And so when I think about the great short story writers, I study them, I teach them. It's not so much because I think I'm like them or because I've inherited something from them. It's because I feel like I'm always engaged in an ongoing process of learning from them, rereading, reading their interviews, reading their stories, teaching them, having conversations about them with my students. And so it's sort of this active engagement that maybe is a little more uncertain than I am their descendant. I think what I would say is that I feel like I am their willing student.
Okay. Thank you again for being here, and congratulations again.
Thank you.
All right. The rest we will come on myself.